Police officers, what was the most heartbreaking arrest you've ever had to make? Story 1. I had to arrest a man because his ex-wife falsely reported him for domestic abuse. It was all part of a bitter divorce and money disagreement. When we arrived at his location, she rolled up in a brand new car, pointing him out to us. This man was already living in a dump, struggling to make ends meet, while paying half his salary in child support. As they started arguing, she spat out, "I don't care if it's not true. I'm going to drag you to court until you pay for everything." It was a chilling moment, not just because of her words, but because she said it right in front of us, almost daring us to react. The man was distraught, worried about his dog he had to leave behind in the apartment. He had no one to call for help. After my shift, I drove to his relative's place to hand over the apartment keys, hoping they could at least take care of the dog. The whole situation felt profoundly unjust. Story 2. It wasn't an arrest, but the memory still haunts me. There was an elderly gentleman in his 90s, a local who had long since lost the ability to drive safely. He had been in several minor accidents, and another incident would mean the end of his driving days. One day, we found his license plate embedded in a freshly dented car. Another officer and I went to his home to talk to him. Oscar, as I'll call him, wasn't there, but his boyfriend was. A kind man, he welcomed us in and shared stories of their life together. Oscar was the one who brought home groceries since he was the only one with a license. They relied on him. We returned to the station to find Oscar already there, speaking with another officer. Watching them, I saw the confusion on Oscar's face as he was told about the accident. He looked at the bent license plate like it was an alien object, completely baffled. When the officer explained that he had to surrender his license, Oscar's hands shook uncontrollably. He tried again and again to pull his license out of his wallet, but he couldn't manage it. In the end, the officer had to help him. We stood there in silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavily in the air. It was the end of an era for Oscar and the beginning of a much smaller world. Story 3. 3 years ago, as a public radio producer embedded with police, I witnessed some truly heartbreaking arrests. One that stands out involved a guy who, after being dumped by his girlfriend, called the cops and claimed she was suicidal. When they arrived, she was given the choice of either being taken to the hospital for psychiatric evaluation or taken into protective custody. It was a sad and manipulative act that highlighted the emotional turmoil some people experience during breakups. Another incident involved a woman who cornered and brutally beat another woman in a 7-Eleven parking lot, all over the attention of a used car mechanic who had hit on one of them while waiting in line at a Dollar Tree. The sheer pettiness and violence of the situation were shocking. Then there was an older man in his 50s or 60s who was arrested after using one of his crutches to smash a window to gain entry to an apartment. He had just been released from jail that afternoon and tried to return to his last known residence, only to find other people living there. In his back pocket were his release papers, a poignant reminder of how some people struggle to find stability after incarceration. Cops often deal with a lot of criticism, some of it deserved, but they also face an overwhelming number of situations that are just plain sad. Story 4. I wasn't the one making the arrest, but I witnessed a slow-motion disaster at the VA hospital. A veteran drove himself in, clutching his chest in pain. He was having a massive heart attack, but hadn't called 911, typical of someone who never wanted to ask for help. Once in the ER, the cardiologist whisked him away to insert stents in his coronary arteries. During the commotion, he realized his legally owned, fully licensed concealed weapon was in his jacket. He immediately informed a nurse and asked for an officer to secure it. A few hours later, after his procedure, a junior officer showed up with a summons and a $2,500 ticket. The officer apologized, saying his supervisor made him issue it. The veteran, who had been saving what little he could to help his daughter move closer with her new baby, was in tears. This added stress was the last thing he needed right after a heart attack. I hoped the judge would throw out the charges, or at least reduce the fine. The whole situation was garbage, an unnecessary burden on a man who had already been through so much. Story 5. My uncle, a seasoned police officer, once shared a story with me that still sends shivers down my spine. He had arrested a 15-year-old girl for killing her bully, a 16-year-old who used to be her friend but had turned into her tormentor. Every day, the older girl would insult and beat her. One day, the 15-year-old snapped. Armed with a razor blade, she attacked her bully and hid the body in an abandoned well under her house. The girl was arrested a week later after the police, following a lead, found the body. The full story was grim. After knocking her bully unconscious with a blunt object, the 15-year-old had dragged her to the basement, then upstairs, possibly wrapped in a tarp. An hour later, without calling for help, she took a disposable razor from a toolbox and stabbed the unconscious girl multiple times in the stomach. The court didn't go easy on her, as it wasn't just a case of self-defense. The premeditated nature of the attack, taking place over the course of an hour, sealed her fate. It was a tragic story of how relentless bullying can push someone to commit an unthinkable act, but it also served as a harsh reminder of the complexities and consequences of such actions. Story 6. I used to work at a halfway house, and one resident, Bob, was particularly nice. He was just happy to be out of jail and back in the world. Bob wasn't allowed any vacations or visits for 6 months, but had been granted a special vacation for Christmas to see his daughter, whom he hadn't seen in over a year. He worked tirelessly to afford presents for her, despite most of his paycheck going to the state. On Christmas Eve, during our routine checks, Bob's young daughter, around 6 or 7, answered the phone. We asked if Bob was home, and she innocently replied that he was at the casino. We had no choice but to call his parole officer and my boss. Bob called back within minutes, insisting he had been home the whole time. When we arrived, he claimed it was his brother, Rob, who was at the casino, even showing receipts to prove it. Despite his pleas, it was too late. As we took him away, Bob clutched his daughter, tears streaming down his face. "Sorry I can't be around for Christmas Day to see all your presents, but Santa's coming," he told her. That night, I cried, heartbroken by the scene and the injustice of it all. Story 7. My dad was a cop, and he had his share of unusual encounters, but one night shift at the front desk stands out. A homeless man came in and asked if he could sleep in one of the jail cells for the night. My dad, following protocol, told him that he couldn't stay unless he was under arrest. The man didn't argue. Instead, he walked over to the payphone, gripped it with both hands, and ripped it off the wall. My dad watched, a mix of resignation and understanding in his eyes. He arrested the man and put him in a cell. As the cell door closed, my dad couldn't help but reflect on the desperate lengths people would go to for a warm place to sleep. It was a minor offense, but it spoke volumes about the man's plight. Story 8. I work at a juvenile detention facility, essentially the county jail for those 18 and under, sometimes up to 21. It's heartbreaking when kids come in, beaten up by their parents or others, and often lacking basic necessities like shoes or shirts. It's even more frequent and disheartening when they come in without both. It's a tragic cycle. These kids, who've been severely neglected and abused, often end up in trouble. It's easy to feel both sadness and anger, knowing these kids never had a fair chance. They were never taught anything right, and the system just seems to compound their struggles. Story 9. I work in long-term care, and at the time was a marketing rep for a memory care community in California. One day, a woman came in to discuss placing her husband in our care. Mr. and Mrs. A lived in Hawaii, and Mrs. A had planned a trip to California to visit their daughter. She found a retirement community in Hawaii where her husband could stay for a few weeks with supervision, meals, and activities. Before leaving, Mrs. A gave her husband strict instructions to drive the car back to the community after dropping her at the airport. She even had him call her to ensure he arrived safely. Unfortunately, a few days later, the police informed her that Mr. A had taken the car out again and, during his drive, had hit and killed a pedestrian. He was subsequently incarcerated. Mrs. A returned to Hawaii and spent several months trying to get him released. Eventually, due to his advanced dementia, Mr. A was transferred from prison to a mental institution, a place unsuitable for someone with his condition. Mrs. A hired an attorney and appealed to the court system, seeking a more appropriate setting for her husband. Mrs. A walked into my community, hoping to find a solution. As a former fiduciary, I understood what the judge would need to release Mr. A into our care. We crafted a detailed plan guaranteeing that Mr. A would never be allowed outside the locked dementia unit for any reason, including outings, social activities, or family visits. The judge accepted our plea, and Mr. A was released into our community's care. He still has no understanding of why he is there, and Mrs. A carries the guilt of allowing him to drive, knowing it was not appropriate, but not wanting to restrict his independence. This story serves as a sobering reminder that loved ones with dementia should not drive, and removing their access to a car is a necessary safety measure, not a limitation of their independence. Story 10. A few years ago, I got a call to a skate park about kids allegedly smoking drugs. My partner waited in the car while I walked around, eventually picking up a strange smell. Following it, I found 4 little kids, probably around 7 or 8 years old, behind a shed. They were passing around a bag, huffing whatever was inside. 2 of them ran off when they saw me, but the other 2 stayed, looking ragged and beaten up. They smelled like they hadn't showered in weeks and were clearly high. One of the kids had a knife, though he was too messed up to use it. I called my partner over for backup and tried to process what I was seeing. The kids looked up at me with glazed, vacant eyes. My partner took them away while I picked up the bag to see what they had been huffing. It was a moment that brought tears to my eyes, both then and now, as I recall it. Seeing such young children in such a dire state was truly heartbreaking, and it's a memory that still haunts me. Story 11. Working in EMS, I've heard my share of harrowing stories from cops. One officer told me about a call they received for a drunk and disorderly man. He was naked, running around a hotel pool area, and screaming incoherently. They called for an ambulance to rule out drugs, psychosis, diabetes, or any other medical condition. In the ambulance, the man gradually became coherent and shared his story. He remembered going to a restaurant to meet a man he had connected with online. The next thing he knew, he woke up naked in a strange hotel room with injuries that suggested he had been assaulted. His date had spiked his drink with a chemical causing amnesia, rendering him unable to recall the assault. The cop emphasized the thin line between suspect and victim, a lesson learned from this distressing case. The man's frantic, horrified reaction when he woke up had led to the police being called, but it also highlighted how easily someone could go from being perceived as a perpetrator to a victim. Story 12. A few years ago, I got a call to a skate park about some kids allegedly smoking drugs. My partner waited in the car while I walked around, eventually picking up a strange smell. Following it, I found 4 little kids, probably around 7 or 8 years old, behind a shed. They were passing around a bag, huffing whatever was inside. 2 of them ran off when they saw me, but the other 2 stayed, looking ragged and beaten up. They smelled like they hadn't showered in weeks and were clearly high. One of the kids had a knife, though he was too messed up to use it. I called my partner over for backup and tried to process what I was seeing. The kids looked up at me with glazed, vacant eyes. My partner took them away while I picked up the bag to see what they had been huffing. It was a moment that brought tears to my eyes, both then and now as I recall it. Seeing such young children in such a dire state was truly heartbreaking, and it's a memory that still haunts me. Story 13. One evening, while my friends and I were enjoying a barbecue, my friend's dad, a retired detective, joined us. He'd had a few drinks and began recounting a harrowing story from his career. He and his partner had responded to a home invasion in an affluent middle-class suburb. It was a gruesome scene. A father and his 2 young children had been brutally bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat. Strangely, the house wasn't even ransacked, and the only items stolen were a big screen TV and a video game console. The detectives eventually caught the 2 perpetrators as they were still fleeing, carrying the big screen TV in public. Both were around 19 or 20 years old. They confessed, saying they wanted the TV and video game console they often saw the kids playing with through the big living room window. They decided to kill the family to leave no witnesses. The most heartbreaking moment came less than an hour after the crime scene was taped off. The wife and mother arrived home in a taxi, returning from a week-long business trip, to find crime scene tape, police cars, and coroner vehicles surrounding her house. To make it even more tragic, this was supposed to be the detective's last month on the job before retirement. Those young men had serious issues. It's hard to believe someone could commit such a heinous act just for a TV and console. I think one of them must have had a deeper, darker motivation beyond simply not wanting to leave witnesses. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity. Story 14. I've been a cop for 20 years, but one Christmas morning remains etched in my memory. I was driving down the street when I saw a car run a red light. I pulled the car over and found a single mother with her 2 children, aged about 6 and 8, in the back seat. They were clearly struggling financially, their clothes worn and faces tired. As I ran her information, I discovered she had a felony no-bail warrant. My heart sank. I had no choice but to arrest her, knowing that it meant her children would have to go with CPS on Christmas morning. The kids cried as their mother was taken away, and I felt a deep pang of guilt and sorrow. Every Christmas since then, I've thought about that family and wondered how they fared after that day. Story 15. Though I'm not a police officer, my involvement in the CPS system has led me to witness some heartbreaking situations. One such case began with a call from a concerned relative. She could hear 2 young children inside an apartment but couldn't reach their mother. The kids wouldn't open the door, and neighbors had reported seeing them playing alone outside for hours at a time. When the police arrived, they forced the door open. Inside, they found a 2-year-old and a 9-month-old alone. The state of their diapers suggested they hadn't been changed in over 24 hours. There was no visible food that the toddler could access, and nothing for the baby. Cleaning chemicals had been spilled in the bathroom, adding to the dangerous environment. The children were taken into protective care. Their mother didn't return until 36 hours later and was arrested upon arrival. She refused to meet with her court-appointed attorney, declined all services, including counseling and rent assistance, and didn't attend any hearings. After 18 months in the care of a responsible family member, her parental rights were terminated. This case weighed heavily on me. The neglect was so blatant, the children so vulnerable. I often wonder how social workers cope with seeing such situations regularly. It's a sad reality, and this particular story left me feeling deeply unsettled. There was no silver lining, no fight for survival, just pure neglect and the consequences it wrought on innocent lives. Story 16. The fluorescent lights hummed above as I stepped into the storefront, my badge glinting under the harsh light. The store's asset protection agent, a middle-aged man with worry lines etched deep into his face, approached me. His voice was heavy with a mix of frustration and pity as he recounted the tale of the man I was about to arrest. Over the course of 10 months, this employee had embezzled money from the corporation. Each week, he would make the store's cash deposit late and skim money off the top. To cover up his theft, he'd take money from the following week's deposit, creating a vicious cycle. By the time I was called in, he had stolen up to $32,000. I listened as the agent told me about the man's desperate story, a sick daughter, and mounting hospital bills. He had promised to pay back the money, but the hole he had dug was too deep. I wondered if it was just an excuse, a fabricated story to garner sympathy. When I found him, he stood up immediately and put his arms behind his back, ready to be cuffed. There was a resigned look in his eyes, a mixture of guilt and despair. As I searched him, I found the evidence. Bills from his daughter's hospital and, to make matters worse, an eviction notice from his landlord. The reality of his situation hit me hard. This wasn't just a case of greed. It was a man drowning in desperation, trying to stay afloat for his family. Story 17. Working in social work, I've seen many heartbreaking situations, but one memory will forever be etched in my mind. I was part of a program for children with mental health issues, typically involving voluntary participation from families. One day, during my shift, a young boy around 8 years old was brought to the program by a social worker and a police officer after being removed from his home. The boy could not stop crying, repeatedly asking what he had done wrong to be taken away. His tears were endless, and he fully placed the blame on himself, unable to understand that he wasn't at fault. The anguish and confusion in his eyes were heart-wrenching. I've worked in many stressful and sometimes traumatizing areas of social work and mental health, but in that moment, I realized I could never do the job of a social worker who removes children from their homes. To all the cops and social workers out there doing this tough work, I appreciate you so much, every single day. Story 18. The house was eerily silent when we entered, the only noise the faint hum of the refrigerator. After a thorough search, we arrested the man for possession of drugs and firearms. As he was taken away in handcuffs, the only other person in the house caught my attention, a 1-year-old baby. As a new father myself, seeing the child in such a state hit me hard. The baby was shivering, holding on to me with all his might. He wore only a dirty diaper, and the house had no other diapers, no food in the fridge, no blankets, nothing. I gently cleaned him up and wrapped him in a towel, the only thing I could find to keep him warm. As I held him, his tiny fingers clinging to me for dear life, I felt a lump form in my throat. It was all I could do to keep from crying until CPS arrived. Story 19. I've worked with law enforcement off and on for over a decade, though never as a licensed peace officer. One story that haunts me involves a suburban town police chief and one of his rookies. The rookie had responded to a call about a full-term fetus found by the family dog in a burlap sack in the backyard. The family's teenage son and daughter had a child together, concealed the pregnancy, and buried the baby immediately after birth, hiding everything from their parents. The rookie officer, tasked with confirming the presence of the fetus, couldn't bring himself to do it. He called his chief, begging him to come and confirm. The chief did and ended up taking the teenagers to jail. The weight of that discovery still haunts both the rookie and the chief to this day. Story 20. I wasn't a cop, but I witnessed a sad arrest while working at a movie rental shop. One day, a man walked in, browsing the aisles casually. I saw him slip a movie into his pocket and inform the owner. As the man tried to leave, the owner tackled him. What most people don't understand about the MPAA is that rental copies of movies are licensed differently and can cost around $300. The man had stolen a rental copy, making it a felony. Had he stolen a for-sale copy, it would have been a minor theft, valued at only $20. To make matters worse, this was the man's third felony, which meant he faced 20 to 25 years in prison. I couldn't help but imagine him in prison, explaining to fellow inmates that he was serving time for stealing a movie. It was a harsh reminder of how a seemingly minor act of theft could have devastating consequences.